Welcome to the module on capitalism and democracy. In the context of the capitalism, we actually define an economic system. So when we refer to different kinds of economic system, we have the notion of capitalism, socialism, and also the coexistence of both public and private sectors. This capitalism basically refers to the private ownership of assets. So by the statement on the private ownership of assets, we basically mean that where the private agents are given the entire authority or the autonomy to regulate the course of action and thereby determine their decision-making process, and finally they look their private interest. So in this particular context, we actually consider the forces of demand and supply, which is affecting the society's interest. So actually by the economic system or by the capitalism, we basically refer to an economic system where private actors are playing the major role, their interests are taken into consideration, and thereby they determine the nation interest. In this context, we want to elucidate on certain basic features of capitalism. The first feature that comes in is the concept of competition. So whereby we are dealing with a competitive market or a competitive structure, we thereby believe in an institution which must be in exist, that is the institution of market, and thereby the term called market forces. Here the market forces basically refer to the forces of demand and supply, where the consumers and the producers are the major players. So in this particular market, the consumers are basically required to display the price at which they desire for the goods and services, and the producers on the other hand will actually supply. And in this process, the generation of profit will take place, and thereby the profit-seeking attitude is one of the most important motives of a capitalistic society. So a capitalistic society, unlike the socialism, will look after the interest of profit maximization and at the same time look after the mutual interest of both the producers and the consumers. So actually here we find out the concept of the business firms who will be operating and thereby will make the competitive structure to work. So when we talk about a competitive structure, we basically refer to a market-driven economy where there are forces of demand and supply, and thereafter the capitalist owners will come up and their interest will be solved. Secondly, we go for the formation of the enterprise. So when we refer to the enterprise, we basically refer to the freedom of the enterprise, the occupation and the control. So here enterprise is basically an establishment which must operate within the framework of a capitalistic society. So anyone can launch a business they choose in a free market. So when we're introducing the word free market, we basically deliver on the market forces of demand and supply, and that is how the business firms operate. So here also we refer to the skill set, the interest, and how these skills are basically become channelized and how they become effective. In the same way, there is also freedom of entering the market. This is very important because here the freedom refers to how the market players are basically taking their positions in terms of market share, and thereby they own the capitalistic society. In this context, also we bring the role of the trade unions, the suppliers and the businesses who are also in agreement with the employers. So whenever we talk about enterprise, whenever we talk about control, basically it is the control of the private agents who thereby occupy the space and they control the capitalistic classes. This also boils down to another dominating feature of capitalism, that is the ownership of property or the ownership of private property. Whenever we refer to the properties, we classify as public and private properties. Public properties are basically for the mankind, where there is a collective consumption for the general welfare of the state or the economy. But by private property, the individuals display their private rights and thereby they own over it. So hereby we go by the capitalism, which lies on the economic freedom and the ownership of the resources. So thereby the private enterprises come in the picture. They basically set up the owner of the private property with the resources and the value. So these resources are actually being priced, and that is the valuation is being done, and thereby it goes into the authoritative discretion of any private agent. Moreover, individuals and the businesses can transfer their own property or capital goods such as they do in the contracts or the deeds. And that is how the ownership of the private property comes in use. Moreover, when we look at the basic objectives of the capitalism, we refer to the profit motive, and thereafter we bring the concept of invisible hand. So what do we mean by the word of profit motive? Basically, instead of collective interest as we follow in a socialistic society, here we are basically referring to the self-interest. So self-interest can be in terms of profit maximization, in terms of additional perks and benefits, in terms of rewards. That is how the businesses and the capitalists will manage their resources. They will continuously do with the services and how the society will get benefited. So that is what is underlying in the profit motive of these organizations. When we refer to the invisible hand, it is because of the demand and the supply that will equilibrate and the mutual interest will be satisfied. This was actually pointed out by Adam Smith in the theory of wealth of nations in the 18th century, whereby the public good, the societal advantages, all will be driven by the self-interest, and that is how the equilibrium will take place in the market by mutual interest of consumers and producers. This basically gives us less and less intervention of the government. So whenever the capitalism comes in a full-fledged way, then the government's role gets minimized or mitigated. And that is how an economic philosophy advocates for the notion that markets should be left alone and allowed to self-regulate. This is what is meant by a self-correcting mechanism in the market. So it is not that the intervention of an external agency required to satisfy the interest or to correct any market imperfections. Market imperfections should be corrected automatically. And thereby majority of the capitalist nations have a mixed economy because in this correction process, the social interest can be affected and thereby the social norms can be also adversely done. So this is where the capitalist nations call for a mixed economy where there is a coexistence of private and the public agents. Moreover, we find out that the government intervenes in terms of the policy decisions such as imposition of tax, grant of subsidy, or any kind of tariffs is imposed to stabilize the market. And thereby the social welfare is taken care of. Because only leaving to market forces may actually discriminate the social welfare and the public safety. So therefore, the pay for defense, public safety, conservation of natural resources that can be taken up in the government intervention. Secondly, we talk about the consumer sovereignty. This is very much important because in a consumer materialistic world, consumer demands must be well addressed by the suppliers. So when we talk about the market economy, then the great portion of the market economy is driven by the consumer demands, whereby the level of production is taken care of and consumers is free to choose among the different sets of products. And that is how the consumer's demand gets recognized. And also there is a role of an entrepreneur. So whenever we are inviting the term entrepreneur, this is basically referred to a kind of a self-sustained economic process, whereby the capitalist built is on the entrepreneurial class. And who are this? They are basically very much competitive in nature because they require a healthy competition to survive and also to progress. So entrepreneurs are basically the most important players of today's economy's dynamism. And that is one of the most important component of any capitalistic society. This basically refers to what type of factors of production are also embedded within the capitalistic process. So by factors of production, we mainly refer to land, labor, capital, and organization. So when we refer to a capitalistic society, we talk about a private enterprise. So a private enterprise would be concerned about the surplus value of labor, which will be evaluated in terms of the rent or in terms of the profit. So profit from an organization or the rent from the land. At the same time, private companies should also control the combination of factors that will give them optimum returns. Because they go for profit maximization on the one hand, which is driven by the cost minimization principle. So basically, whatever surplus product will be generated, that will be actually privately owned in this particular forum or in this particular framework. So any surplus also will be distributed to the society. So factors of production is basically inherent, and thereby the profit and the rent are mainly the surplus value that can be generated out of the factors of production. This basically gives us some kind of intuition on the concept of democracy and its interlinkages with the capitalistic society. Because in a developing country or in a dynamic economy, it is very much important to understand what is the relationship between the capitalism and the democracy. Because democracy comes with a common goal of a common satisfaction of all, whereby the electoral or any kind of process must be transparent by engaging a larger mass of the population. But capitalism may contradict in its process because it is basically referring to the self-interest, ownership of private property or rights in the hands of few. So this basically lies in the democracy, where it talks about equal opportunity for the influence in politics. So by equal opportunity means every individual or every citizen should be given the freedom to raise their voice, their speech and expression, and thereby participate in the decision-making process. So whenever we want to treat individuals as equals, there is also a question of providing them equal opportunity. But in a capitalistic society, as it is based on a materialistic world, the valuation of the property, which is measured in terms of monetary units, plays a dominant role. And as a result of that, the notion of political equality is getting lost to some extent. And that is what is mentioned here, that given the prevailing norm to the view that individual persons as equals, those will have equal opportunity for influence. However, when money plays such a crucial role, then the nature of political equality or any kind of notion regarding that gets lost. So business holds a disproportionately large amount of political power compared to other interest groups. So whenever capitalistic society comes in a bigger shape, then there has been rise in the model classes of different kind of class struggle. And these different modes, which will represent different income groups, starting from high, middle income or upper middle income, lower middle income, all these different groups refer to different classes, and thereby the conflict also rise out of a capitalistic society. So one prominent account on the value of democracy is that which treats all the citizens equally, because any collective decision is mutually beneficial for all of them. But in case of a capitalistic society, there are certain disagreements regarding this. So always there is a kind of a trade-off between these two terminologies, democracy versus capitalism. This basically lies to some of the evidences in the history of political thought, how this democracy and capitalism can be interlinked. So this goes back to the 19th century, when the inequality was in the rise, and the farmers, individual workers, all of them are struggling to protect their standards of living. So they were basically suppressed, they went for demonstration strikes, and also the shutdown took place. So thereby, at that point of time, Karl Marx started with the Communist Manifesto, advocating the revolution by the workers to end the capitalist economic system. Because these capitalist classes were mainly dominated by the multinational corporations, who were driven by the self-profit maximization motive, and which were against the doctrine of socialism or the collective welfare. So many demanded the right to vote should come up on a democratic electoral process, so that the government can elect the officials who will look after the economic interest, the social interest, and the welfare for the society. This also refers to a greater share of political power, which they can be suppressed or they can be basically distributed among the many. And that is how the wealth accumulation will take place. However, it is found in the advanced nations that the wealth is basically driven by the capitalist nations, which gives rise to the inequality, wage disparity, and creation of the capitalist classes. This boils down to the issue that democracy is a political system, and in order to understand this interlinkage with the capitalism, it basically lives on certain principles. The first principle is that it gives equal political power to all citizens. This is very much inherent with the inclusive growth process of today's economic environment, whereby it wants to engage greater population in the decision-making process. It's a shared growth, it's a participatory growth. so that individual people have the freedom of speech, have the freedom of assembly and the press. Secondly, election process or the electoral process. So they should be given the freedom to select the political leaders by means of elections, where they should be given the eligibility to vote, and also it also take up the issue of no kind of monetarism or dominance that should come up. So in many societies it is seen that the rich have the representatives to govern them, and they satisfy the second condition, but it's not considered the democracy in the word because the less were excluded. So this kind of exclusive mechanism which happened in the Athens, where the slavery started, all these things are basically boiling down to capitalism to a certain extent, but at the same time democracy should come up in a proper shape. So by democracy we mean equal opportunity of status, equal eligibility to come up, and thereby how the economy or the nation can gain out of this transparency in terms of collective decision making. This is very much instrumented by the connections between capitalism, democracy, affluence and inequality. These four terms are basically defining the framework of this political economy. So the framework of the political economy is defined by the capitalism, where the capitalist classes are enjoying all the rights. Democracy, on the other hand, is another pole which calls for equal opportunity. Affluence is actually the reflection of capitalism in a society where the rich classes come up, followed by the consequence, which is the inequality in the wages. So thereby the contrasting role of the government comes up in four different attributes. So when the government is emphasizing the word of democratic, it calls for a transparent electoral process where every citizen should be given the right to vote. On the other hand, when the government wants to prescribe any capitalistic policy, say in terms of inviting MNC, it is basically driven by the profit motive or the self-interest. And accordingly, government has to struggle with different levels of economic inequality. So if we take some examples of specific countries like Japan and South Korea, where government plays an important role in setting the direction of their economies. Because whenever we are playing the terms like capitalism, democracy, affluence and inequality, sometimes a long-term vision of the economy may get lost. So to regain the focus, it is very much important that the government must intervene and government must prescribe policies regarding the income generation, how that income or the revenue can be spent on the welfare mechanisms, so that the inequality which is the result of the capitalism can be mitigated to a certain extent. This also goes back to the other countries like Denmark and Sweden, where the payment of the taxes reduce the inequality in how much people money have to spend by the half. That means that the people are given more purchasing power in terms of redistribution of resources, which has been gained by the capitalist classes. This boils down to the concept of the institutions, which must play a pivotal role in this regard. So in the capitalistic society, we have the institution of modern corporation, which was popularly known as multinational corporations in today's word or today's language. So who are this? They are basically the effective ownership rights are given so that they can operate with efficiency in a market-oriented structure. Here also we talk about the stakeholders who enjoy the private ownership, that we mean by the shareholders. And at the same time, the responsibility comes up as a liability because if any one of the companies get losses, then the shareholders have to pay for that or have to pay the cost for that. So this basically comes up with the advent of corporations within the purview of democracy. So what are these? These are basically organizing the human capital, the physical capital, the financial capital, because they are laying the foundations of each of them and also allowing the economies of scale to operate. Moreover, when we consider the consumers, these consumers have the voting rights. So consumers are given a democratic power. At the same time, they also will call for a better transparency and accountability. So on the one hand, the corporations will look after the profits, will look after the allocation of the resources. On the other hand, the consumers with the democratic power to vote will call for a better accountability and transparency in the system. That's why we talk about more governance and less government. And this calls for also good governance in any kind of economy. The issue of monopoly capitalism and its alternative perspectives. Because by monopoly capitalism, we will be able to accommodate both the poles together, the poles of capitalism and the other pole of democracy. So when we talk about monopoly capitalism, we basically refer to the dominance of the corporations who operate in an oligopolistic structure, and thereby they are small in number because few in number, but they dominate most of the modern capitalist countries. So basically they go by the process of evolution, the transformation, and that is how the industrial units are built and how they will contribute to this economic growth and prosperity. This also refers to some of the historical examples like the Tigers of Asia or the East Asian success, where we find out that during 80s, due to the forces of globalization, China has become one of the most prominent players in the global economy. Moreover, we talk about the economic surplus, which is also carried forwarded in the capitalism. In this regard, the democratic power or the democratic policy will say that the surplus needs redistribution so that equal opportunity can be provided to all the citizens. When we talk about the capitalism, it also creates the fund creation. But in most of the times, the fund is basically referred as a deadweight loss because it is not distributed within the economic or the consumer or the producer surpluses. So the monopoly capitalism approach in its different perspectives calls for an oligopolistic market whereby the players are few but they run by profit maximization. But on the other hand, it should have some kind of socialistic behavior in terms of equal opportunity when we want to accommodate democracy within the purview of capitalism. So we can talk about the micro and the macro element which should be integrated. Micro element refers to how the surplus can be distributed and thereby the factored income can rise, and macro refers to how the funds can be created at a global level. So thereby we observe that another macroeconomics can come up in this microeconomic framework that is basically considered as perfect competition in most of the Keynesian economics, where we talk about an ideal society where all the surpluses are identically distributed and they are actually distributed in terms of different gainers. This basically refers to the most important summing up of these discussions where we say that capitalism and democracy are interlinked with each other. So when we talk about the capitalism, we refer to the classes of the society whereby the profit maximization takes place and thereby the surplus is generated within the heads. These heads may be firms, may be investors, or maybe the entrepreneurs, and thereby the features of capitalism are taken care of. So among the features, it is very much inherent that the profit motive, the entrepreneurial classes will develop, less government intervention will take place, and thereby more and more private players will come up. These private players will definitely invite the MNCs or the corporations to be there. But these MNCs and corporations are driven by strong profit motives or self-interest. So at times, government must intervene and thereby make a pivotal role in terms of allocation of resources. So this brings in the discussion on interlinkage between democracy and capitalism. Because democracy, on the other hand, should call for more and more equal opportunity in terms of the citizens, in terms of the rights, and obviously in terms of the right to vote. They call for transparency and they call for accountability. Because whenever we talk about a capitalistic society, we basically refer to the concept of the MNCs and the consumer's demand or the consumer's sovereignty. But in a capitalistic society, consumer sovereignty is respected and recognized. So democratic power should try to recognize their rights with the help of modern corporation. But on the other hand, the forces of demand and supply should not outweigh them. On the other hand, when we talk about alternative perspectives to monopoly capitalism, thereby the role of democracy also crops in. Because monopoly capitalism basically refers to dominance of the capitalist classes who are enjoying all the rights, and thereby they have a tendency to eliminate the common interest. But a democratic structure will definitely go for collective interest maximization, and thereby will play an instrumental role to make some checks and balances in the rights of the capitalist society. So whenever the government will observe that there is a high pricing comes out from the demand-supply interactions, it will intervene and mitigate the price rise, or at the same time also will try to grant some subsidy so that the equality can be registered. So in this module, there has been discussions on 4 important terminologies like affluence, inequality, followed by democratic as well as capitalism. So capitalism, affluence and inequality are basically interlinked, which goes in the same direction. But on the other hand, the capitalism also should come in the process and makes it more effective. But democracy and capitalism can be accommodated together with the intervention of government in a market-oriented economy, whereby the government must intervene at different phases wherever there is a mismatch between the demand and the supply, or the social interests are getting prohibited, because that will call for a welfare state, and that can only make both the principles of democracy and the principles of capitalism to coexist.